Thank you very much once again, and welcome to this collaborative series of interviews between Africa Uncensored and the Elephant. And today, John Alenamu of Africa Uncensored and I are very lucky to have Dr. Njoki Mwarumba, who's a professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She's a disaster management professor and a practitioner as well. And she specializes in public health emergencies and pandemics, with a focus especially on those who are facing social vulnerabilities. Karibu sana daktari.
Asante sana, nashukuru. How are you all? I'm
very, very well. Thank you very much for making time to join us today. I know John is going to ask the questions, but I wanted to ask how are you keeping in the US? How's your family? We've only been watching on television the kind of crisis in various parts of the US as a result of COVID-19.
Thanks for asking that. And really, to me, this is an honor and a privilege, to be honest. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you two gentlemen here today. So the question is about how I am doing and how we are doing collectively. So starting with myself, to me, I feel like I'm in a lab setting because this is my area of study, and I'm very interested in just about everything that's going on everywhere. Not a very realistic goal to achieve. So I move between screens, whether it's my television screen or my phone screen to keep up with the latest that's going on around, different locations. So to me, it's a challenging time to the extent that I have to balance my interest and excitement with the topic, and maintain the reality of the demands this has on myself as an individual, physically, emotionally, mentally, and then also consistently maintain the empathy that this scenario begets, right? Collectively, and my family as well, thank you for asking, they too are having to go through, I think for us as parents, and what have you, it might be easier for us to grasp the whole, stay home because, it makes sense, it's a public health mandate. But for the younger ones, it becomes more challenging because I have college-age students and children. So things are changing, so we are adjusting to all that. How are you all doing? I think that's also something I would like to know.
You're well under lockdown and getting used to this new normal. And it is, it's a time to reflect, even though the pandemic causes a lot of anxiety. It also causes one to think of the opportunities this moment presents.
For sure, we're also well. Yeah, we're also well. Again, like you, trying to cope with the challenges that are presented. Unlike you, my kids are just entering school, so we're also trying to adapt to what that means in terms of their learning. The school term has started. And like many parents around the world, struggling with the challenge of being able to work from home and manage the family on a daily basis. So as a caveat, actually, if you hear any background noise of screaming children, you know where that's coming from. It's not from them, it's from mine.
It's from yours. I think that has been the very consistent theme is people, we have had to teach online and life goes on, life doesn't stop.
All right. Sorry, I just had to switch connections there. I think people are using more than one device at this time, so we're all competing for the same internet. But let me launch into the interview with a question that you sort of like built the preamble to, right? So you're in disaster management. You've been watching what's going on globally. How are we doing from that point of view, from where you sit? How is Kenya doing? How is Kenya doing perhaps in comparison to Africa and the rest of the world? And then maybe after that, we can define from your point of view what then disaster management would mean in our context.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much for that question. So how is Kenya doing? How is Africa? How is the world doing at large? what I would like to start by saying is that disaster management is fairly misunderstood in many contexts, not just Kenya, right? To the extent that when you discuss disaster management, the thought immediately is about response to an event, right? Rather than, okay, the work that goes into disaster management before an event happens. So you're talking about the mitigation aspect of it, the preparedness aspect of it, and also the recovery component, right? So if I was to pick a metric with which to measure Kenya for, Africa as a continent and the world as a whole, the question that you're asking is, were we prepared? Did we mitigate, right, for a pandemic? And across the board, the report card does not look very good. Okay, the report card does not look very good because we know that consistently there's a challenge in getting policymakers, our politicians, the people, the key stakeholders who are making decisions, and even the citizenry, right, to invest in a low probability, high impact probability, like a pandemic, right? It's one of those events that is not right there sitting in front of your face, so you're not necessarily responding to it. So to that extent, it seems too far removed. It seems like it will never really happen. What are the chances? And there are more pressing needs, right? So even in well-resourced countries, Europe, in the US, in some of the South American countries, and the better resourced African countries, we are seeing that investment in long-term thinking and strategic thinking of events such as this one, low probability, high impact, has really not been quite solid. So the report is going to come out quite evidently and more robustly when we are over COVID, but so far the indicators do not look good for how we have failed to invest, in systems, in individuals, in institutions to try and prepare and protect for this.
Which is interesting because this isn't the first time perhaps that we've had disasters on the scale that would require a response, that a large enough response that would mitigate against the impacts of it. We faced natural disasters before. I mean, disasters that are brought on by changes in the environment. We've faced disasters that are brought on by human activities like terrorism. So it's interesting that we weren't prepared. And if you've been listening to Bill Gates and as well as the many epidemiologists around the world who've been tracking when a new coronavirus would spring itself upon the world, then this really wasn't that low probability, high impact possibility. It was more of a when will this happen situation. But be that as it may, we are where we are. Explain to us then what disaster management would mean now that we're in the middle of a pandemic, now that we're in the middle of facing the impact of such a pandemic.
Okay, thanks for that question. So you're right. You're very right, John, in your posture about the way in which, yes, this, people have been talking about this happening, but the reality of it is that we really have not mainstreamed disasters. We're not as individuals and as communities and as nation states quite into the reality that disasters are part of life, that we're going to live with them, and so we need to prepare with them. So what we tend to do is think about the ones that are seemingly more on a routine, right? The river will flood at this time, there's hurricane season, tornado season, so closer home, so to speak, or right now the challenge that we're having with locusts, right? Things like that. But then things that, what are the chances to happen? That's what I mean by, the pandemics, the climate change. That's where we have really not quite applied ourselves, whether it's because of limitation of resources or just not being able to compete that way. Yeah. But you ask a question about what we should be doing now. So the first thing we should be doing really is pulling into the resources, and leveraging the resources that we already, have put in place, right? So, and that's why I say it's going to be like a report card. So looking to see what are our health systems like right now, and regardless what the state is in, how can we leverage what we have in hand, right, to prepare and to respond because right now we are in the phases that require for us to be responding to the pandemic, right? How do we do that? And that varies on a really wide spectrum. There's everything from looking at the individual, is there individual preparedness? Is there personal preparedness at all, right? Yeah, and once you answer that question, then you go higher and ask yourself then, okay, if individual preparedness has not happened, how can the larger institutions from the community, to pre-existing organizations, including private businesses, the public organizations, how then can they support the resource of the individual or the resource of the community when they are overwhelmed, because that is what is happening. Now, unfortunately, the challenge here is that this state of being overwhelmed and overrun and just being very engaged in response is global. Okay, it's global. So the cavalry is not necessarily coming. We normally depend on the humanitarian organizations, international humanitarian organizations, to very forcefully come in and support us. So that paradigm of expecting the humanitarian support or the military support, right, is really challenged at this time, right? Because every person is dealing with this pandemic at one phase or another across the world. If you're not quite at peak, you will be at peak, based on what the epidemiologists tell us and based on what history tells us, right? If you are past peak, you need to be preparing for post-peak, right? So there's those challenges about what we should be doing, and we can go into that, into the specifics of that later. But for now, we are in the response phase, and that is what our focus should be on, leveraging what we have, taking in the data and understanding what do we need, where do we need it. So resource allocation.
Great segue for us to discuss the one-size-fits-all approaches that have been taken, in different countries, taking the lead from the countries that have been hit first. So we're seeing phased reopening of the economy in different parts of the world. I think South Africa is going to be doing that over the next 2 days. Kenya announced that they haven't called it phased reopening of the economy, but with the directive on reopening of restaurants and the kind of means through which people would sit and interact and how you can order alcohol, it seems that there's a yearning to return to normalcy that follows through on what's been happening in other parts of the world. Yeah. The challenge that some of us who are observing with this see is that it really isn't a one-size-fits-all answer that you're trying to pose to the question of COVID-19 in Africa, in Kenya, right? And using the same sort of philosophy that you were talking about in terms of using the resources that you have. What are the resources that we have? How are we applying or misapplying them from where you sit? And what can we be doing better so that we're not just following on from what other people around the world are doing, whether or not it matches what we need?
So I like where you've gone with that, starting with the reality that it seems like we're trying to apply a one-size-fits-all, okay? If you study disasters, if you study, even if you're just a sociologist, you really do understand that one size does not fit well. Our sister talks about it and talks about there's nothing like a single narrative. The danger of a single narrative, right, is discussed, and that's something that has not worked for us. We saw it with the SAPs, that did not work for us. We have seen with all these measures that have tried to be applied, from a cookie cutter type approach, really have not been contextualized for the communities and the societies and the realities, right? And the vulnerabilities, and even as you're looking at the vulnerabilities, the social capital that exists in a country, right? And that ties into what you're asking about, what is it that we can do? So essentially, it's a question of looking at what can we leverage that we already have in place, right? So that we can use that during this time as we we continue to respond to this pandemic. And unfortunately, if just looking at data, before we get to peak time, before there's a major surge, before we are seeing quite high impact on the community and individually, I think that's a question. I would like at this moment really to honor one of Ebola fighters and one of the women who I really look up to. Her name is Fatu. Fatu in 2014 in Liberia was like everybody else in her area, going through life, right? So she was going to nursing school, okay, locally, but at the same time there was the reality of Ebola, and she also had to balance the reality of the demands of her family, right? So Ebola hit a family member, and then it hit another one. She went to hospital and realized that the hospitals were overflowing. There really wasn't enough room, and the risk was very high. They couldn't get into the hospitals. So what Fatu did was she took the knowledge. She really hadn't even graduated yet, but she took the knowledge that she had, right, and went back home and used baseline hygiene and preventative measures, non-pharmaceutical interventions that were working for Ebola, and tried as best as she could with the rudimentary basic facilities that she had, right, to apply those to respond and save her family. So this is an individual using their own social capital, right, to protect herself, her family. And that's exactly what she did. So she actually used regular trash bags as PPE to protect herself. She had some masks, I think, and whether they were made or not, I do not know. And then she had gloves, and then she also used gumboots, right? Gulashes. She wore those, and she isolated as best as she could, right? Out of her family members, there was 4 of them. They only lost 1. Okay, which when you look at it from an epidemiologic perspective, that was excellent, because not only did she save 3 other family members, she did not get infected herself. The reason I paint that picture is because we really need to be looking internally. Internally, I already talked about the need to shift from this humanitarian approach or very militaristic approach, dominant model approach. Someone is coming. This someone has all the knowledge. This someone has all the resources. This someone will tell us what to do. And the assumption is that when that someone tells us what to do, people will follow, right? In a very linear fashion, they're going to follow and do what needs to happen. That thinking needs to shift. It needs to shift. The reason being that it is the personal and individual and communal level, right? Community level, almost like nyumba kumi before you even get to county level, right? That needs to start preparing themselves by doing a quick social vulnerability assessment. Who are the elderly? Who are the sickly in this community? Who are the immunosuppressed? How do we address what their needs are going to be? Who has maize? Who has beans, right? Who has flowing water, right? And how can we chip in to that water bill and control that water so that we can have a consistent flow of water, right? Or just sufficient water? Who has gathered water? It has been raining, right? So that is where we need to start. The expectation that government, the expectation that some organization is going to be who finds solutions for us needs to shift, right? The way this can shift is if we trust people with information and not control information, which is the key commodity right now. It's the key commodity. People need information. We cannot measure out and dole out information so that we maintain control of the narrative and control of seeming power, right? We need to decentralize that information. We need to tell people the truth. Disaster research tells us that people can handle the truth. People don't necessarily just panic and start doing things that don't add up. Quite the contrary. If you give people actionable information, they will be, and give them the truth. And in pandemics, unfortunately, part of the truth has to start with listen, this is an evolving situation because it's a novel virus. So start the conversation with, this is what I know, this is what I do not know, this is what we are working with, and we will let you know when we know.
All right. So, Njoki, the question then begs, right? So if these answers exist, or rather this philosophy exists about how to handle pandemics and disasters, especially when you're communicating with the public, why is it, and perhaps this is a fairly elementary question for those of us who've lived on the continent, why is it that there's such a yearning, such a falling back on the habit of trying to control a narrative that globally is almost impossible to contain?
I can address it from a gender perspective. I can address it from a socio-political perspective. I can also say that the political ideologies that we live in and those realities, all those combine, right? To kind of try and address the question that you just asked, which is, why are we still trying to control the narrative? Yet, if anything else, the pandemic, the coronavirus itself is actually the boss right now.
It is.
It requires that we approach it with humility. I'm telling you, it requires that we approach it with humility, regardless whether you're a virologist, epidemiologist, medical doctor sitting somewhere, someone in the country, someone up in an urban setting, New York. This virus requires that we approach it in humility, because we are on the learning side of this virus. We are trying to decipher, decode, right? So we're in school, essentially. We are the students here. So we should take that posture of trying to learn. Now, that premise right there is very challenging in a socio-political ideology that requires for you to have those same temperaments, those same approaches. Because then you have to admit that there's some things you might not know, that there's some things that you might have to consult, right? So you might have to bring in a scientist, or you might have to bring in a political foe, right? Because this requires a whole of society approach. It requires that you bring in even contrarian voices, people who have opposed you, communities that have opposed you politically, is what I mean, or socially, people who you have not previously, because we either all recover together or we all recover together, right? There's no partial recovery from this. So you can't do the response partially too, right? You can't play favorite. So that is where I see the key central challenge being, is that this requires for a paradigm shift, a thought shift. It requires for us to clear those vestiges in order for us to allow emergence, right? New ways of thinking, innovation, and consultation. So I think that is the central organizing thought that I would have behind why we are having a continued holding on to control. I think there's also the reality that the people who are seemingly in power are who are politicians for the most part, right? Over and above maybe not having that humility, right, are operating at a wavelength that is very different from the people who are actually the professionals who have been working in this field, who have been talking and writing and trying to draw attention to some of the social vulnerabilities and some of the hazards like pandemics, right? So here you have people who are term limited, politicians, right? So it is more difficult to sell what the professionals are saying to the citizenry to the extent that it might just not be palatable. Social distancing might not be palatable, right? What might seem palatable is the handouts, because the handouts can be directly tied back to the owner of the hand that is handing out.
The individual.
You understand? So ideologically, there's a clash there. You're telling people, even your basic citizens and your at that level, individual level, you're telling them to shift how they think. You're telling them to look to somebody else, right? So the politician who is standing in front of the podium might be quite concerned, yes, about what's going on with people right now, but they also have another metric, which is elections are coming. How is the party going to look like? How am I going to look like in my next step up, right? Without understanding again that this is a very, this pandemic, this outbreak is very leveling. It's a very leveling experience, right? Those differences, the virus is no respecter of boundaries, social capital, lack of, it really isn't. So there's those two aspects that I think can respond to why people, I believe, are still trying to hold on to a very centralized narrative. We are also very used, and this is the last point I'll make about this, we're very used to a very dominant approach, right? When it comes to dealing with the enemy, we use very militaristic language. We approach it from, I have the answers, so you need to listen, dominant approach, rather than the consultative one that looks at what are the social and indigenous resources that exist, and how can we integrate those, create convergence, and address the challenge.
Mm-hmm. Now, that encapsulates a lot of the thinking that we're seeing both here and in other countries, Tanzania being perhaps one of the more extreme examples of the top-down approach so far in East Africa. In as much as Yoweri Museveni has been blamed for all sorts of things during his tenure, you can't argue with the results that his Minister for Health is getting. And perhaps this is because of the experience and also knowing that they can shift to a more consultative approach when it comes to dealing with pandemics. But the question I want to ask now, as we wind down towards the end of this, is there have been two streams of thought, or rather two competing streams of thought. So we make a very strong epidemiological response to COVID-19 at the risk of the economy. Or we open up the economy and invite herd immunity into our lives, and then have the fallout that would emerge from that with a large percentage, upwards of 5% of the populations of people who would get COVID dying from the disease. Why is it to you that there's such a reliance on the either or? So it's either we survive and the economy doesn't, or the economy survives and some of us don't, but we move on.
Yes, that really has been the conversation. It seems like the two are diametrically opposed, right? And that the two cannot coexist. You have one or the other, right? And this is not an original thought, but I did hear someone ask or make the comment that we cannot have a healthy economy with a sick population. Mm-hmm. We cannot have a healthy economy with a sick population. And that's even generous, because if you try and apply herd immunity, you're going to have, a very diminished population, because you're going to lose a lot of people and a sick population. So I think that's a premise we really need to internalize and understand, that the decisions that need to be made based on objective criteria. Mm-hmm. They need to be made based on objective criteria. So what's the objective criteria right now? The economy is very important, especially for the recovery component, right? Disaster cycle is such that you have mitigation and preparedness, then impact somewhere in there, then people respond and recovery happens, right? And it's cyclical. There's no clear cut when one happens or the other, but for us to to recover and to be robust and resilient in our recovery, some of the key elements that need to remain in place during disasters, right, is a healthy population. The work of disaster management is to save and preserve lives and livelihoods, okay? But the challenge that we have right now is one that is directly threatening lives, directly threatening lives. So our objective criteria here is to save lives, as many as we can, understanding full well that there's some people who are going to be more vulnerable than others, but just try and save as many people as we can. So we're being called to make decisions and to make priorities, but not at, it doesn't have to be at the expense of the economy, right? That we make the decision about saving people. It's a question of resource allocation. Where do you apply most of your resources? Maslow's hierarchy. So save people's lives,
yes,
by making sure they are well protected, they are well fed, they have water, they have the basics that they need. That criteria is fairly objective. So the question should be, how do we do that without tremendously jeopardizing the economy? Now, it might mean that our metrics of economy have to shift, right? And we have to throw a whole lot of what we consider as economic stability onto making that objective, meeting that objective criteria. But if that's what we need to do, that's what we need to do, right? So decisions around reopening, decisions around loosening up different kinds of criteria should start with the question about, how does this support life? How does this support livelihoods, right? And so that's the thinking that has to come into that. One size does not fit all. It's different based on what the realities are in a community. All disasters are local. It starts with the community. So having national level decision made across the board, right, is not necessarily going to be ideal, because it's not reflective of exactly what's going on down to the people who are actually having to respond. So that's an overall statement. There's a lot of detail that could go into that, but that's just the thinking about, we really have to make decisions based on objective criteria. And we also need to understand that we cannot have a healthy economy with a sick population or without people.
Yeah. This is a bit of a doozy that I want to throw your way. I was having a discussion with a public health expert about the state of our community health workers. And it seems that the challenge of being able to redirect the resources that we have into the right places becomes doubly hard when you have a public health infrastructure. Just as an example, a public health infrastructure where the people who are doing the work of cleaning up, sanitizing locations that perhaps had exposure to COVID-19 and doing the non-health interventions, making the non-health interventions that need to be made for a population to be healthy are volunteer workers, which is the case here in Kenya. Add to that somewhat of an endemic disease that we've had for a long time, which is corruption. If I can just superimpose that onto the conversation that is currently happening right now, with 40 billion shillings being spent, quite a bit of that on tea and snacks in the middle of a pandemic, right? It seems almost hopeless, and I say that advisedly because there always is hope, but it seems almost hopeless that there will be the kind of paradigm shift that we require for us to be able to get over this. So, Njoki, I'm asking you, what would it take for sense to be shaken into the people who need that sense to be shaken into them for that to happen?
The professionals need to play a significant role, right? And by professionals, I mean the epidemiologist, the public health person that you are talking to, the community health workers. They are professionals. They need to play a role. The community health workers, you talked about that they are working as volunteers. And my question is why? Why are they working as volunteers when they are risking their lives to do the work that they are doing? They are frontline workers, right? So that is very questionable. It goes back to what I said about criteria. What criteria are we using, right? Why are we not protecting the people that we should be protecting? The role of government is to protect the individual, right? And the community, especially when their resources are low. That's what we're going through right now. So it's questionable why that is happening. Why are people working as volunteers? That's where the money needs to be going. You bring up the aspect of corruption, and it really is a strong reality. I will say that whenever you look at a scenario, you really, the metrics of measurement, again, going back to the metrics of measurement, are really critical, right? I'll give you an example. Whenever we look at we look at studies that are done around the country, okay, and decisions are made based on specific measures, specific metrics. For example, looking at health per capita expenditure, right? Very rigorous studies are done, and a decision is made based on a country X gets this amount of money, right? As a researcher, as a policymaker, as a practitioner, if you're not asking the question about how much of this money is getting to the community health worker, really getting to the community health worker who needs it, right? Then we are doing a disservice. We're doing a disservice because the metric that we are using does not consider data that exists, for example, on corruption index, on human development indexes. We need to not only use the quantitative hardcore measures, but also look at measures, integrate data that looks at social measures of wellness and wholeness, and how the human is actually being impacted, right, by all this money or resources that you're throwing at a scenario. So the question is very valid, right? We have to make decisions based upon some of those measures, for example, corruption, right? So that question, I am hoping, right? This is some of the hope that I have, that is again a metric that now the voting majority in our country use when they are making decisions all over the world, right? All over the world, to make determinations based on criteria such as disaster management. What are your plans in place for the community? What are your plans? Who did you support? How did you use the resources that were given to you? People have to look strictly at that. And that's not elitist thinking. That is very translatable at the level of the individual, where they question their leaderships and equally look to see who is it that was really, really consistently working to make sure that our lives are saved and our livelihoods are supported in this catastrophe. So this is a great time of evaluating and reckoning and developing and encouraging metrics. After disasters, there's a period of time where there's an opportunity, there's a window of opportunity. And I really, really hope that across the world and in Africa and in Kenya, that civic organizations, non-governmental organizations, and even the government itself takes this opportunity, right, to actually educate, and with the goal end of learning and equipping people, right, to really understand how the ripple effects are of policies that are made, without real consultation, right? And without that basic consideration about how the human being is going to survive and thrive in a scenario like we are in right now.
All right, and Njoki, such poignant words for us to sort of wind this down on, that this window of opportunity that we will have is something that we all take advantage of. I certainly hope that it happens where you are as well, so that we don't have leaders even jokingly talking about imbibing sanitizer. And on this end, we also don't have tea and snack parades for much longer, and that we can finally sort of move the needle a little bit, if not a lot, on what we need to do to be able to create more sustainable, more sustainable societies in the days when this pandemic is no longer staring at us right in the face. Dr. Njoki Mwarumba, yeah.
Allow me. Yes, we really have to think about the day after the pandemic. The day after the pandemic, if you look at the pandemic phases, we should be post-peak and post-pandemic, but we are also equally pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, another one will come. And we are once again going to start where we started with this conversation. Yeah. How have we mitigated? What are the resources we have in place so that we can pull on that resource now to respond to the new one? Disasters are not a matter of if, they're a matter of when. They will happen.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I could have put it any better than you have, Dr. Njoki Mwarumba. Thank you so much for joining us. And we sincerely hope that you and your family keep safe and keep healthy, and that we are able to reflect on some of the insights that you've imparted in this interview. Thank you very much for joining us. That's Dr. Njoki Mwarumba, of course, a disaster management professor at the University of Nebraska Omaha. And of course, John and I have been hosting her today as part of a series of conversations with public intellectuals all over the world on what it is we are facing now and how we perhaps will look emerging from the pandemic that is COVID-19. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you, Njoki. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.